Hello, and welcome to our online lecture. Today's topic is looking at westward expansion, race, and the development of the American Empire. Oh, excuse me. If you see my emails, please ignore them as they might pop up during our lecture. A couple of points as we are thinking about what's going on in the decades following the American Civil War. And if we think about the overriding issues of American history, there are a number of interrelated themes. One is the issue of equality, both in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender equality. Another theme is expansion and what that expansion looks like. And the third is what to do with populations who are already here. There is a famous concept that's developed by an advertising agent executive in the 1830s called manifest destiny. And this concept, idea, is the idea that God has preordained all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific to America. And of course, it is coined by an ad agent. And it's really promoting westward travel. And that idea takes on real shape here in the United States. That concept is still around in various forms, even today. So let's start to think about what that means as if white people claim that it's God's providence that they claim all lands, then the question that's been here since the beginning about what to do with indigenous people, whether they are Native Americans, Mexicans, or of other non-British nationalities, is something that the United States continues to grapple with. And in the story of the development of the West, that is seen very clearly with what happens to Mexicans and the status of Mexican American ancestry after parts of Mexico are seceded to the United States. We also will see sort of the end of indigenous sovereignty at this point. By the 19th century, the quote-unquote Indian Wars are over, and the United States begins to wage wars with indigenous populations across the Pacific, like the Philippines, Hawaii, the people of Guam. And it takes these ideas of Indian removal and colonization and conquest with them. So today we're going to look at some of the things that are happening west outside of the American South in the decades after the American Civil War. And now ideas of race and the nation are really fueling westward migration. And Americans, white Americans, believe that they have a right to the land and are willing to do a variety of things, both legal and illegal, to take it from those who are already there. It is worth noting that after the Civil War, there are many African Americans who moved west throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, certainly California, and that this sort of migration, although it happens before the Great Migration, does represent a significant move for people of color outside of the American South after the Civil War. So we're really going to look at these places of intersection, these points where you start to see issues of race, politics, law, all related to expansion. And that race, of course, after the American Civil War, is the most significant organizing principle, just as it was before. Even though slavery is technically illegal, race as the predictor of liberty and citizenship is still very much evident across the United States. And as you think about this and go through this lecture, consider just the differences in how this is affecting different groups across the United States in terms of this white supremacy, how it affects indigenous people, how the codification of white supremacy affects certainly African Americans, also Mexican Americans and Asians, as There are various campaigns in the American West, various anti-Asian campaigns that are led also by white supremacists in the name of maintaining racial superiority. So I like to say that the Mexican-American War really is one of the wars about slavery. And if you look at the Mexican-American War, the outcome of this war is significant. The causes of the Mexican-American War, and as you see in this picture right here, this is the United States, and this is Mexico. So what is currently today California, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. All of that was Mexico before the Mexican-American War. So after the Mexican-American War, you have this as Mexico, a much smaller country. So the United States territory grows in size after this. Mexico obviously shrinks, and this war is caused in many ways by white farmers bringing slaves into Mexico, which was illegal according to their laws, and they're also fighting over territory. The outcome of this war is that the U.S. is going to expand, and that it is going to be able to sort of achieve that idea of connection between West and East. And of course, the American Civil War will be fought the decades after this. Excuse me. So as we will, one continuous theme evident in the American epic is what to do with indigenous populations. Indigenous populations has been moved west, excuse me, nonstop since the arrival of British colonists in the 1600s. There had been numerous treaties that were signed guaranteeing rights of sovereignty to indigenous communities that were later shredded. There had been actual removal policies. The best example of that is the Trail of Tears and the removal of the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples of the American Southeast. But wars were expensive, removal was problematic, and resistance massive. So the U.S. is still grappling with this indigenous question, even in the 1870s. And one idea that really gains lots of steam is the Dawes Act, which is implemented around the late 1880s. And what the Dawes Act is doing is breaking up reservations, trying to get people to identify as independent farmers, breaking up the land in order to access it much more easily. And they are selling Indian land right out from under them, and hoping that populations who are very congested and crowded in cities will basically go and do this. Fueled by this, of course, are ideas about individualism. People in the industrialized East who don't have any room being able to obtain land and become farmers, and that it's very easy. You can absolutely do it. You have to take this land. So there's immense propaganda used in order to promote something like the Dawes Act. Now, at the same time, the Dawes Act is having a real impact on Indian families. Many of them are losing their lands because of the numbers of whites. You have a new generation of who were called landless Indians who did not belong and could not find places to live in reservations across America, but also had no land to go to. There are white missionary schools that had been around for 2 generations at this point and had very much trained children in these schools not to identify as indigenous, which is also highly problematic. for obvious reasons in terms of understanding who you are and where you come from, but also in terms of people having skills to live on the reservation. That's not really being taught at these particular schools. One specific way that the American government and state governments were successful in creating chaos in indigenous lands was to cut people off from their water. And not having any access to fresh water is certainly going to affect how you're able to live. So in these different scenarios, often indigenous people didn't have the skills or even the language to work in American factories or in other types of jobs. So they did commit crimes, thus creating a stereotype of criminal behavior, and even the idea that one could be legally shot for stealing a horse or hung speaks to the types of punitive, violent repression by the state and tactics that were used. Of course, within moves to break up reservations, that also broke up women power. Assimilation into white society very much decreased and underemphasized the role of women. Many women found that they had no role in society as it became more aligned with white ideology and white thinking. There are efforts to create new political organizations to help. And the Society of American Indians was created in 1911 in order for indigenous people to have voting rights, to become citizens, and really participate in government in order to have a better life. Now, indigenous people in California, for example, faced massive discrimination, which was echoed or mirrored in law. There were, again, as I said before, most of the way that people were able to live was by raiding white towns and basically stealing their supplies in order to live. So the laws against these things became quite harsh. And you could see many wanted criminals, and again, people had bounties on their heads. So if you brought in a wanted indigenous person, you could also make money off of this. This is a fairly violent scenario for people, again, who don't speak the language, who don't have any access to power, who don't have any water to survive, and have been marginalized. In the case of Mexicans, as whites and white Americans continued to settle in New Mexico, Arizona, California, they did obviously see existing Mexican communities. People of Mexican descent, the question is, are they going to be considered citizens of these individual states, or will they not be able to participate because they are white? Ultimately, the state of California does allow for some who are there to be considered citizens. Mexican gold miners in California were some of these. Other laws are excluding other people from having citizenship rights. So ultimately, in the state of California, majority of Mexican Americans, or at least legally, will be considered a foreign people and thus denied full citizenship rights. There's also the emergence of another new immigrant population, which were Asian Americans. Now, in the 1850s, a white man, George Hall, is convicted of murdering a Chinese man. And a Chinese there was a Chinese witness. George Hall's lawyers will argue that the Chinese should not be able to testify against whites, and using the same argument that denied African Americans the ability to testify against whites in American legal system. So you have, beginning in 1854, the legal precedent that is stating that Asians are not the same racial categories of whites and this will carry on in terms of citizenship, being allowed to vote, and really becoming a part of communities. Now, for this new generation of Chinese laborers who are immigrating to the United States, the majority will find themselves in California, but also Idaho and other points in the West. This generation will build Chinatowns in cities like Los Angeles, certainly San Francisco, Chicago, New York City, but they are mostly located along the western coast. By 1930, there are nearly 470,000 Asians, or rather Chinese, in the American West, and 90% in the American West. So for the Chinese, as they have a complicated legal status, they're denied citizenship, not considered citizens. They did, for those who are immigrating to mine, they had to pay an additional tax. The Chinese will be considered ineligible to become naturalized citizens because of their status as non-white. In 1878, they are also denied citizenship due to race. But in 1882, the federal government will pass a racist piece of legislation known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred all Chinese from coming in to America, except for certain concessions. And this is the only time in American history that a specific nationality of people were denied entry into the United States. And part of what is fueling this was a anti-Chinese movement known as the Yellow Menace. And what white businessmen and politicians were suggesting is that the Chinese could not assimilate into white culture. Their religion was too different. Their culture was too different. The women were too sexual. The men too interested in raping white women, that it just wasn't going to happen. And they say to protect the virtue of white women, they needed to pass stringent anti-Chinese laws. And this law excluding Chinese immigration is going to emerge out of California and then eventually make its way through the Senate, passing as legislation. And with this, of course, is also miscegenation law. So it becomes illegal for whites and Chinese to marry, legally, of course. And then as you're looking at political cartoons this week, you will hopefully start to see that cartoons have remained a way to engage issues and really bring them to life. And this is an example of how the United States is open to white immigrants and closing itself off to others. And the others, of course, are depicted in sort of these sort of ghostly, demonic faces. And I think it helps to demonstrate just how popularly this was understood and how people were able to even see the issues in the 19th century. Japanese migration into the United States is a little bit different. Although the Japanese will certainly also face discrimination, Japanese women are going to have a much easier time getting citizenship, not citizenship, but getting being allowed into the United States. And part of this comes because as the United States is taking over Hawaii, there were already Japanese migrants living there. So between 1885 and 1920, about 200,000 to 180,000 of Japanese in Hawaii are now going to the mainland. 45% of the Japanese women, Japanese in Hawaii, are women. and there are sizable portions of Japanese women living in California. And many of these are coming over as brides for white men. And nonetheless, there are still anti-Japanese sentiments happening. This is an example of the type of propaganda or community meeting that informational that you would find, right? It says Asiatics must not be naturalized. No Japs in our school. Citizens mass meeting. Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. This is the particular group that is sponsoring this meeting. And it's going to happen rain or shine, apparently. So this was planned for 1906 by, again, the Japanese and Korean Exclusion Group. Christians who were Japanese were also quite complicated, as there had been significant numbers of American missionaries in China as well as in Japan since the early 19th century. However, a gentleman's agreement made between the United States and Japan, again, really emphasized that women should be the ones to come over and not men. In 1924, an anti-immigration act also barred Japanese from numbers of Japanese men from entering, although women were allowed to come. This is also another example of Japanese living in the United States. This photograph of a Japanese family. You also see a pamphlet about boycotting. It reads, "A general boycott has been declared upon all Chinese and Japanese restaurants, tailor shops, and wash houses." So this piece of propaganda, again, is trying to get consumers not to go to these establishments in order to use economic boycott to displace immigrants. As I said before, Hawaii encouraged women as contract laborers. Women and families stabilized migrant workers and made profits predictable. Many of these Japanese women worked in the sugar industry rather. Also, Korean workers were often compared and pitted against Japanese workers in order to certainly keep ethnic tensions within that community. Something that you do see as a tool of colonizers. And also, by the early 20th century, you also see many immigrants also coming from the Philippines. And they were also used as a way to threaten Japanese workers with potentially having their jobs taken from them. Excuse me. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, there are African Americans moving out of the South right at the end of the Civil War, many moving into Kansas, Nebraska, and other parts of the American West. In this way, you have African American entrepreneurs, businessmen. You also have cowboys, ranchers, technicians, blacksmiths, again, people doing all types of technical jobs, planning cities, bringing electricity in. So you have a number of things that are going on across the American West that really speak to Black achievement in Black communities. There is a very thriving Black community being built in Greenwood, right outside of Tulsa. There are Black communities in Texas, and again, thriving Black communities all the way to California. As we will see, however, just as racism is not only pervasive in the South, as immigrants are arriving in the West and other parts of the United States, they are also going to be met and challenged by this pervasive white supremacy that is also across the United States. In Hawaii, the U.S. starts to take over the islands first through a sort of economic way through the through missionaries, but it's the establishment of the Dole Corporation, and Dole still is around. I know you've eaten Dole fruit, pineapples, right? Oranges, prepackaged fruit. Dole really takes over these islands and uses the American military to wage war on the local Hawaiians, who are also led by women, and that's a picture of their woman leader. They attempt to get rid of her in 1893, and basically take over and enslave the indigenous Hawaiian populations and put them to work on this massive Dole plantation. In 1898, the U.S. officially annexes the territory, even though this does not have the support of the Hawaiian population, who now don't have any power left in their community. We would see a series of American interventions also in Central America and across the Caribbean beginning in 1795. However, the rate of increase really picks up in the 1890s when American militaries are dispatched across the Western Hemisphere for pro-American government. So the U.S. intervenes in Chile in 1891, Venezuela 1895. The U.S. goes to war with Spanish over occupation of Cuba in 1898. And it wins that war, also gaining the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and other territories that used to belong to the Spanish. So by the 20th century, the U.S. has not only conquered all the land from Atlantic to Pacific, but is now building an empire with colonies, not called colonies, called territories, across Asia and the Pacific and the Caribbean. All right. I am going to let you review some of this other on your own, but just a couple of things to remember as we wrap this up is that westward expansion involved more than just answering the indigenous question. It also included what to do with Mexicans. It will also grapple with what to do with these new Asian immigrants and how to classify them. So increasingly, the West has become just as multi-ethnic, multiracial as the American East. And yet white supremacy is continued to be used as a way to suppress and marginalize these voices. We will also spend some time thinking about just the impact of the railroads on the West, what it means for the individualization and even fencing of the West, and how through this time American animals such as the beaver are being hunted to extinction. So we will continue to talk about the way that race is shaping the 20th century as well as industry and empire in our next lecture. Thank you.